In 1994, a team of archaeologists excavating a cave in southwestern Germany found something that stopped the dig. Scattered across the cave floor were human bones, about 500 of them. When they examined those bones under magnification, they found cut marks, not the kind left by tools scraping accidentally. Deliberate, clean, parallel cut marks, in the exact same positions as the cut marks on the animal bones found beside them. The humans had been processed the same way the deer had been processed. Same technique, same intention, same result. The site was called Herxheim. The bones dated to roughly 7,500 years ago, and in the years since, researchers have found this was not an isolated incident, not a single moment of desperation in a single community. It was practiced, repeated, and in some cases deliberate enough to suggest that the people doing it had done it before. The question that nobody quite wants to ask out loud is this: how common was this? And the answer, based on the archaeological evidence that has accumulated over the last 30 years, is uncomfortable. It was far more common than most people want to believe, and the reasons behind it were far more varied, far more human than a simple story about starvation. Cannibalism in the archaeological record shows up in two completely distinct forms. Understanding the difference between them is the key to understanding what was actually happening. The first is what researchers call survival cannibalism. This is the version most people are familiar with. Group is starving, someone dies, the group makes an impossible decision. Evidence for this in ancient human history is extensive and goes back much further than most people realize. Cut marks consistent with cannibalistic processing have been found on human bones at sites dating back roughly 600,000 years. Species called Homo antecessor, a predecessor to both Neanderthals and modern humans. These were not our species. The behavior was already there. But survival cannibalism, as disturbing as it is arguably the one form that requires the least explanation. Starvation is a comprehensible motivation. What is harder to explain, and what the evidence increasingly shows, was far more widespread. The second form, ritual cannibalism, deliberate, ceremonial, not driven by hunger, driven by belief. In 2016, researchers re-examined bones from Go Cave in Somerset, England. Bones were approximately 15,000 years old, and what they found went well beyond simple consumption. Human skulls had been carefully and deliberately shaped into bowls. Brains had been removed. The skulls had been cleaned, scraped, and modified with clear evidence of skilled craftsmanship. These were not desperate acts. These were intentional objects, made by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and considered the result worth making. Nobody makes a skull into a decorated bowl unless the skull means something, unless the act of making it means something. The researchers concluded that the skull cups, almost certainly used in ritual or ceremonial contexts, possibly to consume the brain matter of the dead, possibly simply as objects with symbolic power derived from their origin. Either way, the processing of human remains in this way requires a cultural framework that supports and gives meaning to the act. It requires a community that understands what it means, chooses to do it anyway. Neanderthals, the human species that lived alongside our own ancestors and were eventually replaced by them, also show clear evidence of cannibalism. Multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East. Neanderthal bones have been found bearing cut marks, percussion marks from bone breaking to extract marrow, burn marks consistent with cooking. The site of Moulagursi in France, dated to around 100,000 years ago, produced Neanderthal bones processed in precisely the same manner as the deer bones found in the same layer. Same cuts, same breaks, same fire exposure. The Neanderthals who processed those bodies were eating them. But here is what makes the Neanderthal evidence genuinely complicated. Neanderthals also buried their dead at other sites entirely separately. Neanderthal remains have been found in deliberate graves, sometimes with grave goods, which means Neanderthals were capable of treating the dead with ceremony and reverence in some contexts, capable of eating the dead in other contexts. These were not mindless acts driven purely by instinct. Both behaviors were intentional. Both were chosen, which means the Neanderthals who ate other Neanderthals were making a decision within a cultural framework that somehow accommodated both possibilities. Now here is where it gets truly strange, where the modern human record becomes even harder to sit with. Researchers studying the spread of a prion disease called Kuru among the 4 people of Papua New Guinea in the 20th century found something that changed how scientists understood deep history of human cannibalism. Kuru is a fatal neurological disease transmitted through the consumption of human brain tissue, spreading through the 4 community because of funerary cannibalism, a tradition in which the bodies of the dead were consumed by the community as an act of mourning and respect. 4 believed that consuming the dead prevented the deceased legacy spirit from being lost, allowed the community to retain part of the person who had died. What researchers also found when studying Kur was that certain genetic variants that confer resistance to prion diseases present in human populations worldwide, not just in the four. A 2003 study found a specific genetic variant that protects against prion diseases distributed across human populations globally at frequencies that suggested it had been selected for in the past. Implication is striking. Prion diseases spread through consumption of human brain tissue. A genetic resistance to prion diseases is widespread in modern humans. Most parsimonious explanation for why that resistance exists is that exposure to prion diseases was historically common enough to create evolutionary selection pressure. The most likely source of that exposure is exactly what you think it is. The genetic evidence suggests that cannibalism was common enough in human evolutionary history that our bodies developed partial resistance to diseases that would result from it. We carry the evidence of it in our own DNA. The motivations documented across cultures. Cannibalism has been studied ethnographically, are remarkably diverse. In some cultures it was an act of mourning, as with the four. Others it was an act of power, consuming a defeated enemy to absorb their strength or eliminate their spiritual presence entirely. Others it appears to have been exocannibalism, the consumption of outsiders or enemies, rather than members of the in-group. The Aztec practice of ritual sacrifice and subsequent cannibalism was embedded in a theological framework about the nourishment of gods and the maintenance of cosmic order. Wary people of Brazil practiced endocannibalism, consuming their own dead, as an explicit expression of love and grief, arguing that allowing the body to decay in the ground was far more disrespectful than consuming it. What is consistent across almost every documented case is that the act was not random. It was structured. It had rules, had meaning. It was embedded in a cultural context that gave it a logic. However foreign that logic is to modern sensibilities. The Herxheim site in Germany, the one where we started, has become one of the most studied and debated cases in this field, precisely because the scale of it is unusual. 500 human bones, processed systematically, over what appears to have been a relatively concentrated period. Researchers have proposed that Herxheim may have been a site of large-scale ritual activity, possibly connected to social disruption. At the end of the linear pottery culture, a major Neolithic cultural tradition collapsed around the same time period. The violence and consumption at Herxheim may have been connected to whatever was tearing that society apart. Ritual responses to crisis, extreme behavior at a moment of extreme instability, which, if you step back far enough, is not so different from what the evidence shows. Again and again across cultures and time periods, cannibalism in human history tends to cluster around moments of rupture. Collapse, war, famine, migration, loss of the structures that normally contain behavior. Not because humans become animals under pressure, because under sufficient pressure, human groups sometimes reach for the most extreme available expression of whatever they believe, whatever they fear, whatever they are trying to hold onto or destroy. The bones at Herxheim were people. They were processed by people. The people who processed them lived in communities, had beliefs, had relationships, had reasons. The reasons are largely lost. The bones are not. And they keep asking the same question. Not what happened. That part is clear. The question is what it meant to the people who did it. And that is the question archaeology may never fully answer. We do know is this: the behavior you are most certain separates modern humans from their most disturbing past, far more recent than you assumed, and far less exceptional